David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
At this point, if you've been with us for any length of time, you know with almost 100% certainty that when I come to you and I start a story by saying, hey, you know what? There was a rare moment of truth or candor or common sense on Fox News, you can be almost certain that it was Shepard Smith. And previously, we've had a bunch of these different stories for you. We had one where Shepard Smith actually did the right thing and explained all of the different Trump-Russia lies that are circulating. Or another instance where Shepard Smith absolutely destroyed in a very good 5 or 6 minute clip the entire Hillary Clinton Uranium One conspiracy theory. We talked to you about when the truth about Trump-Russia briefly surfaced on Fox News some months ago, and it was, of course, Shepard Smith. We've also played clips for you of Shepard Smith basically disgusted with Fox News' so-called reporting on Baltimore violence and basically setting the record straight on what was going on there. And now thinking back a couple of years, I think this was actually, I remember doing this story when we were still in New York City, Shepard Smith destroying the irresponsible Ebola coverage that was all over the place. So when over the weekend I read Fox News host makes sense on the topic of the government shutdown that we're now dealing with, I figured it was Shepard Smith. And it was Shepard Smith. And in fact, Shep said almost word for word what I tweeted about the shutdown over the weekend. And if Shepard Smith and I are on the same page, you know that he's off the Fox News script. I tweeted, wait, so Republicans control the Senate, House, and White House and are responsible for the lack of an immigration bill, but it's the fault of the Democrats that the government will shut down? And Shepard Smith alluded to almost the exact same point, phrased differently on Fox News. Let's take a look. Let's take a listen.
Back in Washington, there is one discussion: government shutdown. Of course, with one party in charge of everything, a government shutdown will not happen, right? I mean, never in the history of, or at least modern history of the country, has there been a government shutdown when a single party is in charge of Washington? Hook, line, and sinker. House, Senate, White House, one party in charge. That's it. Republicans have it all. Yet the possibility of a government shutdown has escalated. The problem is really in the Senate.
And of course, that was before the shutdown actually took place, which is happening now and presumably might be resolved by the time you listen to today's program. We don't know. They control everything, right? And they can't keep government open. There are some committed Trumpists who have actually figured out a way to blame Democrats here, and they're on my Twitter feed relentlessly, and they've come up with this gem. They're telling me, David, listen, you need 60 votes in the Senate, which includes Democrats, because there aren't 60 Republicans. So it's the Democrats that are shutting down the government by not coming over and agreeing with what Republicans want. You control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and you're saying it's the fault of a few members of the other party that we're having this shutdown? Now, of course, first of all, just because a few Democrats can filibuster in one chamber, that doesn't mean it's their fault if you don't negotiate with them. But the bigger picture is that aside from the Democrats, even Republicans couldn't get on the same page with each other in the Senate or with Trump in the White House. And my fear was that this would work, that despite the reality, as I pointed out, as Shepard Smith pointed out, that Republicans control everything, I was really worried that the right would figure out some way to blame Democrats, and they tried. They tried blaming or naming this thing the Schumer shutdown. Fortunately, that failed, and hashtag Trump shutdown was trending on Twitter. And there's a recent poll which shows that more than half of Americans said, if there's a shutdown, this was before it happened, more than half of Americans said they would either blame Trump, Republicans, or some combination of the two. Only 20-something% said they'd blame Democrats. Not to mention that there actually was a bipartisan deal on the table that was rejected, but Trump, after he said, put something bipartisan on paper in front of me and I'll sign it, he ended up actually not going for that. So I actually hate covering this crap because it's just a political football, which is why, you know, Pat, I didn't cover it in the lead up. We knew this was pending for weeks, and I didn't mention it because The cable news channels have a countdown for days before this thing, endless interviews and fake drama. These are political footballs. Immediately, lawmakers should not get paid when there's a shutdown. California passed a law where if they can't agree on a budget and shut down state government, they don't get paid. They've not missed a single budget agreement since, but it's not going to happen because they all try to use these shutdowns for political gain.
Well, it is a political football, but it does have political ramifications,
Sure.
right? Especially with the 2018 midterms coming up in the fall. And it's interesting to see how the Democrats have maintained their moral high ground on this topic, because they're the ones that are in favor of DACA.
Yes.
They're the ones that are in favor of a clean ship bill. Claire McCaskill actually is in support of making sure that the military members get paid during the shutdown. So
Yeah.
we'll see how it goes for them.
And Mattis actually said, listen, this shutdown stuff is not good for the military, although by all indications, there's not going to be any significant impact or maybe even any impact at all to military operations. It's one of those stories that corporate media foams at the mouth over. It's almost like anything you can put a countdown clock on is really, really great for corporate media. But we've seen this happen again and again. And of course, it is someone's fault ultimately. The fact that it's used for political posturing and tossed around as a political football doesn't mean that we can't objectively assign blame here. And to say it's the Democrats when the Republicans control everything is laughable.
Yeah, and a government shutdown sounds so severe when you put it in those terms, but
Yeah.
really it's what, like maybe 10% of the government that actually closes down?
Most everything happens. Our payroll company reached out to me today and they said, yeah, so just so you know, like absolutely nothing's going to happen
Yeah.
in terms of payroll. Like all the agencies will still accept your tax payments. We're going to file everything for you. Don't worry about a thing. So anyway, a little bit of truth from Shepard Smith. Let's now go to Donald Trump on the issue of the government shutdown. I love a good instance of old-fashioned hypocrisy, and we all know that big picture, Americans blame Trump and the Republicans for the government shutdown that's going on. As I told you earlier, Trump shutdown has been trending on Twitter. Republicans control the House, they control the Senate, they control the White House, and Republicans have been scrambling to figure out who to blame. But I think that if Trump is involved in this shutdown, and he's the president right now, why don't we go back to what Trump himself said about who should we blame when there is a government shutdown? I'm going to play for you here a clip of Donald Trump in 2013 when President Barack Obama was in the Oval Office, and Trump explained, who do you blame when the government shuts down?
Who's going to take the blame, Donald? I mean, in the boardroom here, who's getting fired? Who's going to bear the brunt of the responsibility if indeed there is a shutdown of our government?
Well, if you say who gets fired, it always has to be the top. I mean, problems start from the top, and they have to get solved from the top. And
Interesting.
The president's the leader, and he's got to get everybody in a room, and he's got to lead. You know, the interesting thing is in 25 years and 50 years and 100 years from now, when the government is, you know, they talk about the government shutdown,
Go on.
they're going to be talking about the president of the United States. Who was the president at that time? They're not going to be talking who the head of the House was, the head of the Senate, who's running things in Washington. So I really think the pressure is on the president.
Wow, quite eloquent, right? But of course, Trump now is blaming Democrats for the shutdown, despite that they are totally and completely out of power. What did Trump previously say about how the opposition party should handle shutdowns and negotiations around shutdowns? Well, let's go to the record. Donald Trump tweeted in October of 2013, it is crucial for Republicans to remain united during this shutdown, which is sort of what Pat pointed out in the first segment that Democrats are doing right now. But when Democrats do it and Trump is the president, it's a whole new set of rules. What about claims that Democrats are unfairly tying another political issue, in this case it's DACA, to the shutdown? Well, Trump doesn't like it now, but he seemed to like it when Republicans did it in 2013, having tweeted in September of 2013, congratulations to Speaker Boehner, whoa, excuse me, Freudian slip there, on standing strong and tying government shutdown to defunding Obamacare. Republicans tying the shutdown to Obamacare, that's good. Democrats saying, let's get the DACA thing figured out, that's bad all of a sudden. So what's the trend here? And not just in this story, but in the Trump presidency at large. The trend is, how can I say this? Trump doing exactly what he criticized Obama for doing, or Hillary Clinton for doing during the campaign. Everything that Trumpists thought they were voting against by voting for Trump, they ended up voting for even more bigly than they could have imagined. But at least Trump is pro-life, right? Oh, yeah, well, I guess for the last 2 years, he's been pro-life. First 69 years of his life, he was pro-choice. But the last 2 years, he's been pro-life. So I guess he gets a pass for everything from the Trumpists.
And also, where's the art of the deal here? I thought this wasn't going to happen under a great negotiator like Donald Trump. And it's especially because he won't even lay out what his policy position is on immigration.
He doesn't know.
He does't know what it is.
In the last 10 days, he's said to Dianne Feinstein, he would do a clean DACA bill. That was immediately stricken from the White House transcript until it was pointed out that, hey, Trump did say that, then it was added back in. He said, if you put a bipartisan deal in front of me, just put any bipartisan deal in front of me, I'll sign it. He didn't end up signing it. Like, how many positions has he taken on immigration in the last two weeks?
Chuck Schumer offered him authorization to fund the wall, which he turned down.
Yeah.
That wasn't good enough for him.
I really don't get it. And I don't know how long the shutdown will go. It might be over by the time you hear this. It might go a little longer. We'll see. But what we are sort of coming around to is people need to vote. Do government shutdowns get people to vote one way or the other? I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't know. And particularly when we're, 9-10 months out from the election, I just don't know if people vote based on who they perceive to have shut down the government.
Well, Republicans were blamed for shutting down the government in 2013, and yet they did well in the 2014 midterms. So at least if you look at that bit of history, I don't know if it'll be that consequential for them.
Yeah, I just don't know if it's a voting issue, but I'm curious what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we've got a big league broadcast for you today. Glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Nathan Schwartz. Member of the day? What am I talking about? I know you probably have never heard me mention membership, so I'll very briefly tell you. The program's mostly funded by our viewers. 2 ways to do it: membership, Patreon, membership at davidpakman.com/membership. That's where Nathan Schwartz fits in as today's new member of the day. And Patreon, patreon.com/David Pakman Show is the other way. We are under 100 patrons away from that target for the 12 to 15 part Critical Thinking miniseries.
We really need to talk about membership and Patreon more often, I think.
I know. I feel like just too many, because we never mention it. People don't know anything about it. And it's sad. People really should know about it. Nathan, thank you for supporting the David Pakman Show. Sadly, this next story has sort of been buried by other stories, but there are some pretty major developments in the Trump payoff of a porn star that he had an affair with. And the story continues to sort of fly under the radar. And we're not in a normal sort of situation when the news of a president's affair with a porn star while married to a wife who had just had his latest son, followed by a 6-figure payoff, isn't even the biggest story of the day, never mind the week or the month, right? But the story is getting sketchier and more disturbing by the day. So to reset, this is the story where it was reported that President Donald Trump had an affair with porn actress Stormy Daniels in 2006. He was married at the time. Stormy Daniels initially told a Slate reporter that they had an affair that was sort of a relationship, and that Trump was not sexually skilled, and that Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, and her lawyer came to an agreement where she was going to get $130,000 in exchange for silence on this issue. Once the story started to get more attention in the last couple of weeks, both Trump attorney Michael Cohen, that guy, and Stormy Daniels denied it. Cohen saying it's not true, Daniels saying, I had sex with Trump, but I never had a relationship and I never got paid. Very weird, very suspicious. The entire thing has been blown wide open, and it seems that the MO with the Trump administration is they deny, and the denials lead to even bigger revelations, confirmations, and sort of undeniable evidence about the original thing that they maybe could have just said, yeah, it's true in the first place. And it all relates to private LLCs. Wait a second. Porn star, private LLCs? Well, how are those things connected? LLCs are business entities which can be private and they can be used to hide the names of the people who own the companies. We already had reason to believe that Trump and his family were using private LLCs to hide real estate deals and hide real estate holdings and profits. But it turns out, according to the Wall Street Journal, that a private LLC was also used to make that payoff to Stormy Daniels. Weeks before the 2016 election, Trump's lawyer formed a private LLC called Essential Consultants LLC. It's based in Delaware, and it's typical that these entities are created in Delaware. That's not at all sketchy. It's no sketchier, I guess, than what most companies do. Companies typically incorporated or formed in Delaware. And no further denials so far have been issued by Michael Cohen nor by Stormy Daniels. But if this is to be believed, it's almost impossible to deny because the specificity of the reporting increases every single time that they deny and more details comes out. Michael Cohen denies again, and now we have the name of the LLC that was used as well as the timing of its registration. These are liars, and they can't be believed about anything, but here's the real tragedy. We are experiencing not normalization, but hyper-normalization. We've fallen so far from some basic standard of an expectation of decency, truth, honesty, and morality that not only the facts of this affair and the payoff are barely registering in the news cycle, the series of lies surrounding the affair and the payoff are barely registering in the news cycle. Remember when Republicans went nuts because Obama wore a light tan suit to a serious event and it wasn't presidential? It seems laughable to think that that could have been a pseudo scandal and that Trump's lies about the payoff of a porn actress through his lawyer are barely even getting on the radar.
Well, I think it's because with Trump, this is already baked into the cake. We know who the guy is. He's a philanderer. He's a playboy.
Is that
so this isn't really out of the ordinary. I mean, if it happened to Bush or Obama, that would be surprising because it would go against the narrative of who we think these people are, right?
If that's true, that is a very sad state of affairs, an incredibly disturbing state of affairs. And there's no going back from this by having discourse or whatever, right? Anybody who has been sort of moved or influenced into thinking what's going on is normal, you're not going to convince them. We've just got to vote them out. That's the only path
I'm curious
forward.
to see what the faux explanation is going to be as to why Michael Cohen set up this LLC weeks before the election.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was never again mentioned. Just like we never hear any comment from the Trump administration again, and it gets swept under the rug by whatever scandal is going to break tonight at 3:30 in the morning or whatever. Hey, do you remember that carrier plant in Indiana that Donald Trump and Mike Pence heroically were able to save early in Donald Trump's presidency? He touted it as this major victory for his economic policy, even though it wasn't actually policy. It was just giving one company money to stay in Indiana. It was a handout, right? So that this one company would keep some jobs in Indiana. But we knew it was bogus. And in fact, we heard from the company that the money would be used short term to automate the factory and reduce jobs in the long term. And Carrier previously announced that, you know, even though we got that tax break, I call it a bribe, we're still going to be doing some layoffs. They've now announced that 215 more employees are going to be laid off because their jobs are going to Mexico. 300 jobs were eliminated back in July, 215 more jobs being eliminated now. Chuck Jones, the former president of the local union in Indianapolis, said that he's worried about more layoffs coming in the future. And of course, more layoffs are coming in the future. Carrier said that the big picture of the money they got from Trump was going to be used to automate factories, which in the long term is going to reduce employment, make America great again, right? And I was thinking about how there's usually at least one snake oil salesman in every primary. But usually they don't win, right? They only last for the beginning of the primary. This time it just so happened that the snake oil salesman that was in the Republican primary not only won the primary, but became president of the United States. And depending on how these blue-collar workers in the Midwest respond to this bamboozling by Trump, it might actually help turn some of those Midwestern states blue in upcoming elections. We know that cognitive dissonance prevents a lot of these voters from admitting to themselves that they were tricked. And sometimes they become even more entrenched in their beliefs. But it would be great if at least their job loss, which is horrible and tragic, could be turned into something positive by making them say, you know what, we were tricked. Fool me once, shame on. Fool me twice, you don't get fooled again.
Can't get fooled
That's
again.
the point, right? And that they don't vote for Donald Trump in 2020 is the point that I'm getting to. And of course, by the way, remember that as their severances elapse, a lot of these people that are being laid off, despite Donald Trump giving a tax break to Carrier, they're going to get on public assistance. They're going to start qualifying for a lot of the programs that Trumpists say we need to be pulling money from. It's just a circle. It's a comedy of errors. And long term, what we know is that a one-time cash handout to a company is not going to change the company's plans. It's still cheaper to go to Mexico. They're still automating jobs in the future. The business environment of Indiana has not fundamentally changed because Trump said, hey, take some money and at least say that for now you're going to keep the factory here. It's not policy.
Well, I think some Trumpists would look at this and say that this is anecdotal, right? It's just one example, and it's not any broader implication of his wider economic policy or the tax plan.
You know what I would say to that? When they say, hey, look, because of the tax plan, here's 2 companies that are giving employees bonuses. That's when I would say, that's anecdotal. All businesses got the tax breaks, and 0.00001% of them are choosing to give their employees bonuses as a result. That's anecdotal, not this. This is just kind of obvious because it's not actually economic policy. Hey, remember that Nazi-linked Trump advisor, Sebastian Gorka? You remember him, right, Pat?
Oh, he's one of my favorites.
He's one of
the most smug Trumpists.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. He was ousted from the Trump administration when Chief of Staff John Kelly, the elegant John Kelly, as I call him, showed up and realized that Gorka had to go, and Scaramucci had to go, and Stephen Bannon had to go. Gorka left, okay? I've previously told you about his ties to a Hungarian Nazi party, and I've also previously told you that immediately upon his release from the Trump administration, Fox News immediately hired him, which kind of made perfect sense. Things are not going so well for Sebastian Gorka. Hungarian police have an active warrant out for his arrest. He's reportedly in trouble with the law over firearm or ammunition abuse. That's part one, right? But here's the real stunner. The warrant dates all the way back to September of 2016. That means that not only has Gorka been avoiding justice for more than a year, when Trump hired him, the warrant was already out for his arrest. This is the guy who said he would hire the best people and he was in favor of extreme vetting. How minimal was your vetting to not have realized your own staffer has a warrant out for their arrest? He was working for 7 months for the President of the United States, and he was wanted for arrest in another country. BuzzFeed reached out to Gorka for comment. He told them, don't waste your time. I don't talk to BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed published the story, and then Gorka took to Twitter, where he said, did Glenn, referring to Glenn Kessler from the Washington Post, did Glenn and BuzzFeed get a fakie award from real Donald Trump? They should. Quote, an incident from 2009. Oh, really? I moved to America in 2008. Legally, try facts next time, Glenn. Hack. So 2 things to notice from this tweet. Number 1, Gorka doesn't deny that the warrant exists. That's a very, very important point. And number 2, he says he moved to the United States before the incident for which Hungary wants him arrested. I moved to the United States from Argentina in 1989. Does that mean that there couldn't be a warrant out for my arrest in Argentina from 1992? If I had gone back in 92 and committed a crime or was suspected of one, what relevance does the year I moved have anything to do with it?
And in fact, I think there is one, but we won't talk about that.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, when I was in 1992, when I was 8 years old, I was actually accused of multiple crimes in Argentina. And they all related to steak, that I can assure you. Very strange defense from Gorka. But for me, the funniest part is he wasn't vetted by Trump, who says he wants extreme vetting of immigrants. Reports indicate that if they had done a simple background check, it would have turned up that he had an international, a foreign warrant out for his arrest, which suggests that Trump is not doing the vetting. And is this really the example of the best person to hire? Trump said he would hire the best people. He hired an unvetted, allegedly criminal immigrant, but not to do work and put in windows at one of his real estate projects. He had this guy working at the White House.
Yeah, and Donald Trump is supposed to be the law and order candidate too. And the U.S. and Hungary have an extradition treaty, so I'm sure that Sebastian Gorka will be on the next flight back.
Oh,
right?
I'm absolutely sure. Yeah, he's going to be back. First thing Trump's going to do is get this guy extradited out to Hungary. Don't hold your breath. Pathetic. Discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit. We'll take a break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Gordon Whitman, who's Deputy Director of Faith in Action. He's also author of the book Stand Up: How to Get Involved, Speak Out, and Win in a World on Fire. This is a very interesting issue to me, Gordon, because we've seen, particularly in light of the current administration, a lot of new interest and new voices sort of enter the political discussion, but with a pretty significant amount of frustration in many cases that they're sort of unable to really affect change or be activists in a way that will influence the world around them. So the idea of exploring the best ways for people to be engaged and to impact the world around them is a really important one. What do you see as sort of the primary limitations that might lead to some people feeling as though their voices are not really relevant?
Yeah, it's interesting, David. I think we don't always have enough organizations to contain the energy that exists. And then sometimes those organizations aren't built and organized well enough to really take that desire that people have to make change and give them an outlet for it. So it has been a remarkable year. The number of people who've become involved in politics. I talked to a woman in Annapolis, Maryland, who told me she was spending 70 hours a week chairing her or leading her Indivisible chapter, and first time involved in politics or grassroots activity in her life. And there's thousands of people in that position. And I think, it's been a remarkable year, but we need more organizations and they need to be better organized. And that's really what I try to capture and stand up. And I've worked as a community organizer for about 25 years. So really tried to capture that learning about, how do you make meetings work better and be more useful for people's time? And how do you think about how someone becomes really a leader of change in their own community?
That's interesting, because when one says, as you do, that at least part of the issue is lack of organization, that in a way suggests that it's actually not a systemic problem, that our political system is conceivably set up in a way that all of these newfound activists sort of that have been created over the last 14 months or so, that they actually could be having a greater impact if only they organized themselves better. What about the other side of it, which is sort of the way that the system is designed to maintain the status quo and the structures of power?
Well, yeah, David, I think that's correct that we have a constitution that we're taught to revere, but it was created to make change extraordinarily difficult. And it's no accident that it was written mostly by men who owned slaves and wanted to maintain a status quo. And we can see the levels of frustration that people feel, throughout history and certainly now. But why is it so hard to get Congress to act on things that the American people support? And I think it's built into our structure, the size of our country, the diversity, that change, there are a lot of obstacles to change. Given that, what usually works, and it takes time, is for people to organize themselves effectively. And I do think it's the thing we have the most control over, to build better organizations, not just talk to people who are already involved, but be willing to go out, knock on people's doors, reach people who aren't already part of some kind of social change effort, and invite them in. And I don't think we're doing enough of that.
To take one issue that you would have thought at the time, at least, would have been sort of a simple political issue to solve, which was in the wake of the Sandy Hook mass shooting in Connecticut, there was somewhere between 85 and 90% support for what we would call universal background checks for any gun sale, whether it's at a gun show, between two people, any situation. a background check must be done. Overwhelming support from Democrats and even from a majority of Republicans on that issue. Didn't get it done. Just did not get it done. And there's a couple things people point to. One would be, well, yes, but the gun lobby has such financial influence that it was an issue of the status quo, as we talked about. Others say, no, those people needed to better organize in order to get that done. How do you assess that particular one?
Yeah, I think that both things are true. That, if Congress and any legislature at state level was really paying attention to what people want, we'd have a very different country. So, you can go across the board, whether it's gun violence prevention and assault weapon regulation, to paid sick time, to minimum wage, to so many issues where the public supports a set of policies, and then we watch over and over that legislators do the opposite. And that's, the influence of money is tremendous, and it's driving a lot of what happens in Washington and our state capitals. But I think the other part is it is possible to overcome that. And that's part of what the book is about. Is, it would be nice if it wasn't so, but that's just, part of how this democracy works, that it depends on us as citizens how well we organize. And it is possible to build organizing campaigns that change public policy. And, we're watching right now this whole controversy about the shutdown, what's going to happen to Dreamers. That program DACA that provides legal status, ability to go to school and work and get driver's licenses for immigrant youth, that was really an organizing campaign that at the time when immigrant youth stood up and said, we're here, we're not going anywhere, we're not afraid, and we need protection for ourselves and our parents and our families, people said, well, you can't do that, and we can't do this. We can't do DACA. DACA was an organizing campaign that young people fought for and won, and now it's at the center of our politics. So you look at the accomplishments, whether it's minimum wage or earned sick time or protections, food safety, environmental protection. Those were things that we achieved because people were willing to get involved. And often they started in their local communities. And I think that's the piece we often miss, that we get caught up in what's happening in Washington, what's happening with the president. But a lot of the change we need to see happen is going to begin by making our cities and our states examples and then building pressure for federal change.
In terms of tactics, right, what do you believe has been shown to be the most or some of the most effective tactics when we are presented with writing letters to elected officials, boycotts of different kinds, demonstrations, rallies, marches, getting involved in politics oneself, whatever, right? The full possible list. What is your sense of the most effective tactics for creating change?
Yeah, so the evidence says it's face-to-face with people who have a direct stake making the case. Now, that's not the only thing that works, but I tell a story in the book about a group of people who came back from being in the prison system in California to living in Richmond, California, and were trying to put their lives back together and faced a lot of obstacles to finding work and housing, and began to organize in Richmond, California to make it easier for people to find work and put their, get their lives back on track, and ultimately became involved in an effort to reduce violence in the city, and then made the case that the city didn't need a bigger jail. It needed drug treatment and job opportunities for people who were in the criminal justice system. So they accomplished a lot in their city and really made their city a model, getting the city to decide not to build a bigger jail, but to put that money into education and drug treatment instead. And then that example really became a major part of a statewide campaign to move resources from the jail system to the education system in the state. And I think that's how those were a lot of face-to-face organizing where people who knew the issue went and met with decision makers. When necessary, they held rallies. Maybe they engaged in civil disobedience. So they can use a lot of tactics, but it begins with people who have the most at stake, really standing up and saying, change is possible. This is what we need. We know this. We know this system. We've had the experience, and meet directly with decision makers.
Is there any value, either directly or by virtue of how it might, engage new people, of signing online petitions, sharing online petitions?
There's some online campaigns that have been very successful. Groups like Color of Change have really impacted corporate policies through online campaigns. So they have a role to play. But if you look at both what happens today and in the past, usually it's groups that engage people face to face. And we have a lot of the organization I work for. It's a national network, Faith in Action, used to be called PICO. We have a lot of research on what helps people get involved and stay involved and take greater leadership. It's almost always the face-to-face opportunity to be with another person and tell your story and build a close, trusted relationship with other people in your community who share common interests, and then be able to go meet with and directly confront people in positions of power that are making decisions. So, rallies, online petitions, they're all tactics that have a role to play, but they need to be based on organizations that people are actually members of. And we've lost touch with that membership. Now you're a member of an organization because they have your email address and they send you emails, or you sign an online petition. But you're not really a member of an organization unless you're meeting with other people who are also members. And that social media doesn't do away with the necessity for that kind of grassroots, face-to-face community civic engagement.
Gordon, do you share my frustration? And I know that it's not the most useful frustration in terms of being forward-looking, but the frustration I have that if only a fraction of these newly engaged individuals had just voted in November of 2016, that a lot of this just wouldn't happen. When it came down to 77,000 votes in 3 states that are not historically very red states, do you share that frustration, and does that frustration have some kind of place in figuring out our future plans?
Yeah, I think we should be frustrated that everyone's not voting, and we live in a very different country. I think we need to be clear that it's a very intentional effort over the last decade to make it much more difficult for people to vote.
Yeah.
And that's been systematic. It's been focused primarily on Black and Latino voters. And it's been just very pernicious, from closing voting sites in certain communities to requiring IDs and then making it difficult to obtain them. We're just seeing a very systematic effort to make it harder for people to vote. And that doesn't affect everyone, but if it affects, 1% or 2% of voters who maybe don't drive, so they don't have driver's licenses, you can affect the outcome of an election, which is why that's been such a big focus of efforts to try to hold on to power, particularly among conservatives. So I think, let's pay attention to that. And then, people vote in part because the election is relevant to them. And I think we fail when we don't make the election relevant, when we don't have issues on the ballot, when we don't have candidates that are really speaking to what people care most about. And then it's just hard work to motivate people to vote. And, primarily people vote because other people they know are voting. So my organization in 2016, through our local affiliates, had 800,000 conversations with voters who don't usually vote. And what we find is that if you have those conversations, you engage people at their doors, in their congregations, in their communities, people are much more likely to vote. We need to do more of that. And, that's the big question is this all this resistance and protest marches, do they translate into political power? And that requires creating organization. And that's really our challenge right now, is to build organizations that people can be part of, can lead, and use to govern their communities.
The book is Stand Up, How to Get Involved, Speak Out, and Win in a World on Fire. We've been speaking with the book's author, Gordon Whitman. Really appreciate you talking to me about this, Gordon.
Thanks.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The last segment of today's show, very, very heavy focus on religion. 2 stories about separation of church and state today, and then a voicemail that is also religiously linked. First story is from the world of the justice, or second story will be about the world of the justice system. This first one is about education. In the state of West Virginia, a bill has been proposed by senators which would mandate that every public school at least offer an elective class on the Old or New Testaments of the Bible or on Hebrew scriptures. It was introduced, not surprisingly, by two Democratic senators. Just kidding. Obviously, they were Republican senators in Virginia. I'm not even going to tell you their names since I don't care and they don't deserve anybody know about them. Why do they want these classes to be offered at every school? Because the sponsors of the bill feel that to understand contemporary society and culture, you have to know the content of the Bible. Now, any normal person would say, wait, hold on a second. If the Constitution says there can be no establishment of religion, and then you mandate that only one religion's so-called sacred text be taught, isn't that a violation of the Establishment Clause? It seems pretty open and shut, but let's think through what rebuttals could a defender of this bill give. One would be, hey, listen, it's not a mandatory class. It's an elective class. But it doesn't matter. The fact that one religion's, or I guess you could say, if you consider the Old Testament a sacred text for both Judaism and Christianity, two religions have their sacred text taught in class and no others. That is an establishment of one or two religions over others. The other defense has been tossed around that if you're a states' rightist, we shouldn't pay attention to what the federal Constitution says about this. We should look at what the West Virginia state Constitution says. And I did, and it's still not okay. Section 315 of the West Virginia Constitution, called Religious Freedom Guaranteed, says in part, all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and the same shall in no wise affect, diminish, or enlarge their civil capacities, and the legislature shall not prescribe any religious test whatever, or confer any peculiar privileges or advantages on any sect or denomination. That's pretty damn clear, right? Having your sacred text taught in public schools is a privilege that is being conferred to only one sect or denomination. Lastly, the sponsors of the bill and the bill itself say that the class would follow the law and all federal and state guidelines to remain religiously neutral, but it doesn't say how. And I would argue that the mere existence of the class means they are not remaining neutral, because they are saying, of all the different religions we could teach the sacred texts of in the classroom, we are picking just the Old or New Testament, which apply to one or at most two religions.
Yeah, and you know they're going to cherry pick the good parts and leave out the book of Leviticus and all the horrible parts of the Bible. I mean, I would be in support of like a world religions class, and that would be constitutional, of course.
But that's a history class.
A history class,
Absolutely.
Yeah, where you talk about Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism.
And the history of religion as a phenomena, right?
Absolutely.
And not necessarily the teachings of one particular religion. But this is what we're dealing with in parts of the country. We have real decisions and challenges before us. Pick your poison, right? Economic inequality, climate change, the cost of college, money in politics, net neutrality, whatever. And West Virginia wants every school to be forced into offering a Bible course. Godspeed. That's the only thing I can think of to say. Second story today about separation of church and state, going from education to the justice system. The way our justice system is supposed to work, I guess the way it normally works, although not always, is that a judge presides over a trial to ensure that everything is carried out in accordance with the law, jury selection, how arguments are made in court, how witnesses are questioned, what evidence is acceptable. The judge makes sure that the jury gets the correct instructions, that they're able to deliberate in private without undue influence from outside forces. But in none other than the state of Texas, State District Judge Jack Robeson decided to interrupt the deliberations of the jury to tell them that God spoke to him and believes that the defendant, Gloria Romero Perez, should be found not guilty of trafficking a teen girl for sex. He said, when God tells me I got to do something, I got to do it. The good news is that the jury was not influenced by the judge. They came back with a guilty verdict, despite the judge's claim that God thinks the woman should have been found not guilty. The judge was replaced by a different judge for the sentencing phase, and ultimately the sentence is 25 years in prison. Now, there should be, and there likely will be, an investigation into the judge. This might be a stupid question. I know that as a non-religious person, I might not understand the complexities and intricacies of how God works, but if God wanted the child sex trafficker found not guilty, wouldn't God have communicated that directly to the jury, or maybe have done something to prevent the trial from even starting? Or is this when we can apply that old phrase,
I think it's,
God works in mysterious ways?
I think it's the free will thing, that people have the free will to bring these people to court, and they have their day in court, and humans decide that, and God can't intervene.
But then why would God tell the judge, go and try to intervene with the jury? It just doesn't make any sense, right? I think that's why they often fall back on that phrase, God works in mysterious ways. This is a version of Sharia law, right? It's Christian Sharia law where the judge is deciding what God wants the result of a trial to be. This is exactly the kind of activist judge that the right says they're against, except maybe when it's their Christian God supposedly influencing the jury.
And if you or I did this, it would be jury tampering.
Of course.
It could be held in contempt of court, and we'd probably go to prison for a little while, and rightfully so.
Not only that, if you just replace in the story Texas with Saudi Arabia, people would be saying, hey, this is proof of how insane and backwards they are in that part of the world. And they'd be right. But don't we need to apply the exact same standard to this? Because it's the exact same thing. Hopefully that investigation will happen, and hopefully the judge is disbarred. I'll let you know if and when that happens. All right, this week's voicemail. We've heard from this gentleman before. I don't know what to call this gentleman, but he's someone who calls in with, is it fair to say, like, religious advice?
Yeah.
I don't know how to
Is advice the word?
It's not really advice. It's just sort of
Preaches.
Like, it's preaching of some kind. Yeah. Anyway, 2192 David P is our voicemail number. And here is a bit of, I guess we can call it wisdom for us on this rainy, at least here in Massachusetts, Monday, a very dark and gloomy Monday. Here's a bit of, I don't know what to call it. Let's just listen to it.
Here's a thought on God's kingdom. God's kingdom is a government that Jehovah has set up in heaven. Jesus Christ is ruling as its king. In the future, Jehovah will use the kingdom to remove all wickedness. God's kingdom will rule over the earth.
We've not edited the voicemail. That's if you're saying, oh, that might make sense if we heard the full context. That's the full context. Like, there's just nothing else. I don't know.
Does this relate to anything, like a story we've covered recently?
It occurred to me that it might, but it's so cryptic that I couldn't even begin to figure out what it relates to.
Yeah.
You know?
I need an explainer. I think just the text alone from the Bible isn't going to do it for me.
It's not doing
I
it
need
for me either. Yeah.
interpretation.
If somebody can leave a voicemail explaining that voicemail, that might be useful to us. And then we could maybe follow up and figure out what that was all about. We've got a great bonus show today. We will talk about states bailing out Lady Liberty and I guess it's called Grand Canyon National Park. Is that the full name?
I think so, yeah.
For what we know of as the Grand Canyon during the government shutdown. We will talk about Amazon's surveillance-powered no-checkout convenience store. And we will also talk about this year's flu. This year's flu is a bad one. It's a bad one, and it's getting worse. And now we are starving the CDC of funding, of course, because obviously we all know why. And how is that going to affect treating the flu? And by the way, I do want to make a little bit of a comment on the bonus show about the flu vaccine conspiracy theorists, if you will allow me to go in that direction during the bonus show.
We're going to have time for
that? I think we will. Get access to the bonus show one of two ways. Become a member at davidpakman.com/membership. You will get instant access. Become a patron at least the $5 a month level at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. You'll get instant access to the full archive of world-famous bonus shows. We will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.